Our next speaker will be Reverend Dr. Eniko Ferenczy. Eniko has been the pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church for the last 5 years. She is a native of Romania with a Hungarian background. She also spent significant time in Israel, Palestine, as a Presbyterian Church USA young adult volunteer, and later as a Presbyterian Church we'll start over again, and later as a participant in the World Council of Churches in ecumenical accompaniment program for Palestine and Israel, Eniko is a passionate advocate for peace and reconciliation in the area. Eniko's passion for immigration justice stems from her experience working with refugees and asylum seekers in Hungary. She set up and coordinated a refugee integration program within the Reformed Church in Hungary, based in Budapest. Upon her return to the U.S., she used her experience to pursue a PhD in migration studies.
Thank you, Barbara. There you go. It's a myriad of chords here. Just bear with me for a second. Yeah. It is humbling to be here in the company of our mission partners. I'm really grateful for the ways we are working together and encourage each other and inspire each other in this challenging and so rewarding undertaking to make our communities better places for all. My love for this ministry is rooted in my experience with having journeyed with asylum seekers and refugees in Hungary for so many years. And I share this picture of the southern border of Hungary because it's a connecting story of this issue of migrants and refugees being pushed out and rejected in communities across the globe. And as you heard from Dora and from some of the other speakers, that when one border closes down, people find alternative, often way more dangerous routes. So that's how people who used to go through Hungary from the Middle East, from various Asian countries, various African countries, now are going the way longer route across several oceans and continents, coming up from the south into trying to come into this country. And as you're aware, just recently in this current election season, in the presidential debate, the Hungarian president was highlighted as an example of how to approach the whole question of migration, an example that as a Hungarian citizen I'm not proud of. And so I feel the weight of responsibility to use my story to share a different reality, about a different reality. I came across this artist who is an Italian-French artist originally from Morocco, Bruno Catalano, who was invited back in 2013-ish to create some statues as the city of Marseille was declared the European capital of cultures. And so he created a dozen or so sculptures like this one that is titled Fragments to honor migrants and travelers who are seeking a better life. And all the sculptures are hollow inside because, as Catalano argues, there is a lot lost when one is forced to flee, or even when one chooses to leave their own country to find a better place to live. And I thought, as we are pondering our responses in our various communities, that whole invites us to think, what are we seeing in our neighbors who are of immigrant backgrounds? Do we see their humanity? And as we strive to build better communities, how are we going to fill up the hole? Not that we can ever remake what was lost, but how are we creating new meaning that gives inspiration and that gives grounding and depth and hope for the tomorrow? As we are only too aware, popular culture is shaped by these images of the alien, the immigrant, the stranger, like these movies that since '76, since the first edition, have been repeatedly remade and enjoy quite a popularity. The alien being represented as a threat. It captures this sense that we see fear against the threatening intruder who brings diseases, or allegedly taking our jobs, who bring crime. We see these fears fueling the long history of racism and xenophobia in the country, and how it affects our neighbors, our lives. So that's one story that, especially in this election season, we hear quite amplified. It was a story in Hungary, too, for the last 2 election seasons, where the only campaign for the new government has always been demonizing immigrants. And so I feel like our story, for those of us who are part of faith communities, and myself a Christian faith community, is to tell our story, because our scriptures show a different way of being in the world and a different way of relating to our neighbors in our communities. And we know that there are plenty of Christian communities in this country who are very loud these days, who tell a different story. But I would argue that that's not in our scriptures. So this is just a very brief insight, glimpse of how the Hebrew scriptures, our Old Testament, views strangers, and what our New Testament presents as ways of being with each other in relationship. So just a little interesting fact that the most frequently used term is ger in the Bible. It connotes somebody who is socially, religiously, politically, economically, ethnically different. And it's translated often as stranger or sojourner or resident alien. This word alien figures a lot in immigration legislation in the US. Myself, who is on a work visa here, I'm a non-resident alien, a rare species. So what should be the response to the ger, right? So here is a little trivia for you. What is the most frequent command after love God in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible? So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Any guesses? Love the neighbor as yourself. It's a nice one, but no. Any other takers? That's a good one too. Yeah, that's quite close. Do not oppress the stranger, the foreigner. 36 times. I didn't know that. It's a pretty impressive encouragement, exhortation, right? Do not oppress the stranger. Because who is the stranger? Well, according to our Hebrew scriptures, the stranger is the people of God who were brought out, Abraham and Sarai were brought out of Chaldea, which is present-day Iraq, and then they landed eventually in Egypt, God's people, as aliens. That's the story, the foundational mythical story of God's people landing in Egypt, where they eventually were oppressed and forced into slave labor, as Pablo has already introduced us to that story. But our scriptures also say that God saw the pain and heard the cries. That's the story. So the response to the ger is then to love the stranger and treat the stranger as it would be a native born, remembering that once you have experienced being a stranger in a strange land and you were seen by the holy. So then, in the Hebrew scriptures, this is the primary exhortation for people who follow in God's steps, to love the stranger as yourself, because God loves the stranger. And this collective memory, this story, shapes one's moral identity, shapes all that we do, how we relate to one another, how we spend our money, what causes we support, so forth. And then it's also an exhortation to see the need of the neighbor, provide for the economic needs, but also provide justice for the stranger. There are other views in the Hebrew scripture. We read, and I'm not going to go into detail today, but if you go to smaller prophets like Ezra and Nehemiah, who were post-exilic prophets who came back after the Babylonian exile, came back after long decades of living in a foreign land. For them, it became a big issue, who belongs. And they wanted the local people who stayed in the lands of Israel during this exile said that anybody who had any kind of foreign connection is not welcome. So there are all those views, and how the communities then negotiate who counts and who can be overlooked or even oppressed is a real ethical dilemma that can never be taken for granted, because in each generation, the memory of what went on before fades. Now, quick jump to the New Testament, and I picked the Gospel of Matthew because right off the bat, unique to this gospel, we find this story of baby Jesus and his parents being forced to flee to Egypt to find safety. And so I found this artwork. A lot of artists depict the baby Jesus as a refugee who had to cross the border to find safety. But Jesus is a real border crosser. It's a strong theme in this gospel because he not only crosses geographical boundaries, but also cultural, religious, ethnic boundaries as he relates to various people from across cultural spectrum. He also crosses the gender boundary. In Matthew 15, you may be familiar with the story of the Canaanite woman who has a daughter who is ill and asks for Jesus' help. And because she is Canaanite, Jesus says that it's not his responsibility, and she wouldn't let go of him. She forces him to recognize that even when people are in need, that's common human need should trump all the previous traditions that separate the rituals that deemed some people clean or others unclean. Then one of the quintessential passages that many of us who have journeyed alongside refugees and migrants feel like it's our inspiration and calling card from Matthew 25. If you have done it, to one of the least of these, if you have noticed the one in need, whether the hungry or the one without clothes or those in prison, the stranger, and you have turned with a helping hand towards those, then you are doing what your calling is, your identity as God's holy people, God's sacred people. It's interesting to me that in Greek, the word for stranger is xenos. So the word hospitality, philoxenia in Greek, comes from love of stranger. And so it's one of the other cornerstones of our identity as followers of Jesus, that we are called to love the stranger. And this is in contrast, it's a countercultural way of being with our neighbors, because as scholars point out, in Greek mythology, it was commonly depicted that Zeus, the god Zeus, would visit communities as a stranger randomly to test their hospitality. But it was always a relationship of equals. But in this gospel, the calling for people who follow in Jesus' footsteps is to not only be friendly and hospitable to people who are equal in rank or in the same social class than they are, but really look towards the margins. Who are the invisible people in the community? Who are the ones who have no voice, who are ignored, whose needs are erased? And that's where one's attention and energy and love should be focused and directed towards. So, what does that then look like? What is our story that we are going to tell? What is our calling that we are exhorted to? Is to see the humanity of others, to see the sacred, the holy imprint in each human being. I learned a lot about seeing the full human being when I was journeying with refugees and asylum seekers in Hungary from 2005 to 10. I worked also with a lot of unaccompanied minors. Jeff, we started this school program initially thinking that we are going to help children who come with their parents to settle into the Hungarian educational system. And then every half a year, the population of refugees who arrived to the country changed, depending, we could really measure the pulse of the world in where people were coming from into Hungary. So in the first years, we worked with a lot of folk from Iraq, and then, as you can see in some of these pictures, we had a lot of unaccompanied young men from Afghanistan, and then in the next year, Somalia. And just as I was coming back to the US in 2010, there were a lot of Syrian refugees going to those parts of the world. But we really came to understand what loving the neighbor looked like was just walking with them in the daily life and learning about what was lost, seeing that whole of losing family, losing any sense of security, of a sense of belonging. A lot of them landed in Hungary not because they put the little pin down on the map and said that, oh, that's the country I want to live in. That's where the smugglers dropped them, and then they were even told in some cases that, oh, you are in Austria, only to discover that this language is really strange. It doesn't make any sense how this doesn't sound anything like German. And Hungary has not been friendly to refugees. Until 1997, they did not accept anybody from outside Europe as a refugee into Hungary. That only changed because there were pressures as Hungary started aspiring to join the European Union. They had to adapt to some of the EU standards. And so there was no system in place for young people or families or anybody coming in to really start life. So we were working with, the journey wasn't only with the refugees and asylum seekers, but also, for example, school teachers and social workers, because also those who had an open heart did not have either the resources or did not have the skills and didn't know what to do. So we were together kind of building a system to make life not only bearable, but possible for so many of the people there. And so along the way, I learned too that, coming in as the representative of the Reformed Church, and in some of these meetings, I would sit behind these big signs, that Reformed Church in Hungary, that there was such a power inequality there that I was interacting with people who were so vulnerable and learning how to just sit and listen and suspend my assumptions and expectations as we set up, for example, a housing program. We were using some EU money, so we had accountability towards some of the government entities. And then, these grant administrators like statistics, right? You have to write reports and you have to show that you accomplish things. Well, how do you measure, settling into life? It's really hard to quantify, but we had to kind of figure out a system. And I quickly learned how we had to suspend the expectations there and not relate to our refugee friends as statistic in the government's eyes, only to have our own little shoulders patted that, oh, you have done a good job. Because, for example, like we would give them housing support, so we would help with the rent and help them manage paperwork and just figure out how to do anything official business in Hungary. And then initially there was like a 9 months limit that you had 9 months to receive this support, and then there was the expectation that people will walk out at the end of the 9 months period is like, oh, we are ready now, we know everything. And so we learned through a lot of shared pain how that was just not possible because of so many overwhelming things, just figuring out, learning some of the language, trying to find jobs, trying to just deal with the loss and the trauma and all those things that just, life doesn't work in such clean-cut ways. One of the learnings I took away, and I think it's a challenge for us as we are facing the realities of the present too, is that how to create those spaces where we recognize that our migrant friends have agency and really lean into allowing them to help us navigate this road together and build together in a way that relies on the gifts and skills and the life experience that everybody brings into the story, as opposed to having this one-way street that's all about us kind of patronizing those around us because we think that we have the fuller knowledge, or because we have a certain expectation, because we have lived in another way, how to renegotiate what are the cultural norms and how we are going to do community together. When I first started working with refugees, this family that you see, well, 3 members of the family, the daughter is not present in these pictures, was one of the first people I met in Hungary. I think it was 2006 when I met them. And they were in a refugee camp. At that point, they were refugee camps in Hungary. And their son, who was around 7 years old, was just angry little boy. He has gone through so much trauma, and he just was angry and sad a lot of the times. He was constantly fighting in school, so I would be called in every other day to relate to whatever conflict he was in the middle of. But along the way, along those years, we became really good friends, and so I still keep in touch with them. And I saw them this summer too, but before, on my last trip, I got to visit their brand new apartment in one of the districts of Budapest. And after sharing a sumptuous meal with them, I was getting ready to leave and asked them for directions because I was not so familiar with that part of Budapest where they lived. And so the young man Moheb, who was in a high school, senior year in high school, then offered to take me to the bus stop. So when we got to the bus stop and my boss came, he decided to just hop on the bus. So I told him that it's not necessary because I will know by the time I get to the metro station where to go. And then he stopped me and he turned to me and with perfect Hungarian, he said, "You know, you accompanied me for so many years. What is this extra 5 minutes for me now?" And I still tear up because it was such a touching moment of real connection. And yeah, it was wonderful to see them this summer. After 18 years, they are now citizens. And he is working as a mechanical engineer. And he graduated from one of the Budapest universities in Hungarian. And I know it's a little drop in the bucket, but when I get discouraged or when I face our present reality, I try to remind myself that these are the stories that bring the light into our hearts and that keep us going and just pushes me and inspires me to share my story and to be part of such a network as this, to continue to do our part in forming our collective story and our collective moral identity.